Have you ever watched years of your hard work disappear in front of your eyes, shredded into pieces as if your name and effort never existed? What would you do if your warnings were ignored, your files deleted, and your role replaced overnight by someone who barely understood what you built? Would you walk away quietly? Or would you find a way to let the truth speak louder than their lies? Now, let me tell you my story. Please take a few minutes to listen to my confidences, because what happened to me is not just about betrayal at work. It is about what you do when people erase your name and expect you to stay silent. My name is Claire Dawson. I am 36 years old, and I work as a risk manager at a firm called Stoneford Capital. I was born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, in a family that believed in order, discipline, and the quiet pride of doing a job the right way, even when nobody noticed. For nearly 10 years, I lived in Chicago, building my career one late night and one memo at a time. I was not flashy, not political, not the kind of person who knew how to charm executives in an elevator ride. I was the person who double-checked contracts, corrected the numbers others skipped, and kept the hidden cracks from becoming sinkholes. My desk was my island, always tidy, with pens that wrote the same, calendars that lined up perfectly, and folders that snapped shut in neat rows. It may have looked obsessive to others, but to me, it was survival. That morning, just after 8, I stood in the copy room with a cup of coffee cooling in my hand. The shredder hummed beside me like a patient machine doing what it was told. Out slid the fragments of a memo I had written only 24 hours earlier, a compliance warning marked urgent and signed by me in black ink. I recognized my own handwriting, my own subject line, my own attempt to keep the company from stumbling into trouble. Now it was ribbons of gray paper, twisted into strips as if my voice had been fed into a furnace. I stood there watching, hearing nothing but the low hum of the motor and the flutter of paper as it disappeared into the bin. For a moment, the entire floor seemed distant, like I had been pulled underwater. My first thought was not anger, but a strange, hollow click inside my chest. It was the sound of something final, like a seatbelt locking before impact. I could have said something to the facilities man who came by with his cart, tying up the plastic bag full of shredded warnings, but I did not. He nodded, wheeled it away, and looked at me as if it were just another Tuesday. To him, it was, but to me, it was betrayal dressed as routine. I had spent years filing those notes, marking exceptions, building trails of truth, and all of it could vanish in seconds under the teeth of a machine. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but instead I did what I always did. I straightened the stack of folders in my arms, aligned their edges, and walked back to my desk. Outwardly, I was calm, but inside, I carried the heavy taste of resentment that no coffee could wash away. I sat down and adjusted the screen on my monitor. My calendar glowed with reminders of meetings, deadlines, and yet I could no longer ignore what I had seen. That shredded memo was not an accident. It was a message. It told me that my work, my voice, and my warnings were not welcome. It told me that the new wave of leaders with their polished smiles and endless slides full of synergy had no place for someone who asked hard questions. I had been invisible for years, and I had accepted it because invisibility meant the company stayed out of scandals. But watching my signature destroyed in that machine showed me something different. Invisibility was no longer protection. It was erasure. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not a loud explosion, not dramatic rage, but a quiet and steady resolve. If they thought shredding my warnings would silence me, they were wrong. I had built my entire career on documentation, timestamps, and receipts. They could throw my memos into the shredder, but they could not erase the truth I carried in my files, in my backups, and in my memory. That morning, as I took another sip of lukewarm coffee and opened my inbox, I told myself something I had never admitted out loud. If they wanted to erase me, I would make sure the absence they created would burn brighter than my presence ever had. And in that private vow, the seed of revenge quietly took root. For most of my career, I told myself I did not need the spotlight. My job was not to win applause, but to keep disasters from ever reaching daylight. I was the quiet one in the back of the room with the risk register open, the one who read the fine print and asked the question that stalled the celebration for just a few minutes. My colleagues joked that I was the hall monitor of Stoneford Capital, always circling with a clipboard in hand, always too serious. To my face they said, "Claire, you are so thorough." With the same strained smile people use when their neighbor alphabetizes the spice rack. I pretended not to notice their tone, but I did. What they called overbearing, I called professional. If they only knew how many times my late-night notes and early morning memos had kept them safe from penalties, lawsuits, and broken deals, they might have understood. But risk management is thankless work, and I had learned to live with invisibility. My desk told the story of who I was. A label maker at my right hand, 3 pens in a row, all identical so that nothing would feel out of rhythm. My computer folders mirrored the same order, with each document tagged, dated, and stored in its proper place. My calendar was not just full, it was quilted, stitched together with recurring reviews, vendor checks, monthly lessons learned. Even if only 2 people showed up and one of them came for the donuts, I hosted those meetings without fail. To me, rules were not chains. They were lines on a road, guiding me forward and keeping the company steady when everyone else wanted to speed past warning signs. My reward was not recognition, but silence. When the news was quiet and regulators stayed away, I slept knowing my invisible labor had worked. But silence can be a trap. Over time, I began to notice how my loyalty was used against me. I arrived early, left late, never missed a deadline, and never sent a memo I would not want read aloud in a courtroom. Those habits were my armor. They made me dependable, and yet dependability can make you easy to ignore. Executives stopped hearing my voice. They stopped seeing the effort behind the order. To them, the absence of scandal was not proof of my diligence, but evidence that there was never any risk at all. My work became like air, vital but unnoticed, until one day they began to wonder if they needed it at all. Still, I kept at it. I liked my paycheck. Yes, but more than that, I loved the idea that truth mattered, that small corrections prevented big failures. Each memo I sent was a stitch in the fabric of safety. Each warning was a guardrail. I did not expect parades or promotions. I only expected integrity. And when integrity is ignored, it begins to rot from the inside out. I sensed the rot creeping through Stoneford long before anyone admitted it. Rumors of a merger began to swirl, and I could see the eagerness in people's eyes. They wanted fast wins, shiny numbers, glowing reports. My memos were no longer welcome reminders. They were sand in the gears of the machine. I realized then that my invisibility, once a shield, was about to be twisted into something else. That was when resentment first took root. I had always believed that loyalty was its own reward, that order and honesty would speak louder than politics. But in that office, loyalty had made me disposable. They could erase my name from a system, lock me out of a folder, and pretend the cracks I had documented never existed. They thought invisibility meant weakness, but they misunderstood me. Being invisible had only made me sharper, more careful, more prepared. And when the time came, I knew invisibility would become my greatest weapon, because no one ever expects the quiet one to fight back. The first whispers of the merger arrived in January, spoken in hushed tones near elevators and printed in vague headlines on industry blogs. By March, the rumors had hardened into official calendar invites and slick presentations filled with words like synergy, runway, and clean growth. Suddenly our office, once gray and predictable, buzzed with a nervous kind of cheer. Executives paraded through the halls with new suits and polished smiles, shaking hands like ushers at a theater, rehearsing lines for an audience that had not yet bought tickets. A digital countdown clock appeared on our intranet, ticking away the days until the so-called transformation. People clapped at announcements they barely understood, and every department scrambled to polish numbers, dress up charts, and publish stories of success. The building that once thrived on caution now ran on theater, and I felt like the only one still watching the floorboards shift beneath our feet. I adjusted the way I worked to match the changing tide. My memos lost adjectives and grew sharper, tighter, easier to skim. I clipped screenshots, attached policies, and used phrases so simple that even the most allergic to reading vice president could not claim confusion. I wrote warnings in plain black ink. This will cost money. This exposes us to fines. This violates our own rules. In return, I received emojis. Thumbs up, confetti bursts, even a fire symbol once, as if I had sent a joke instead of a red flag. I taped that one inside a manila folder just to remind myself how absurd it had become. Each empty response was a dismissal dressed as cheer, a pat on the head that left my stomach sour. They thought they could bury risk under balloons and hashtags, but I knew better. Still, I kept trying, because habit is stronger than hope. I told myself that if I kept documenting, kept nudging, someone would eventually hear me. But loyalty can make a person blind, and in hindsight, I see how naive I was. The executives were not polishing the company to protect it. They were polishing it to sell it. They wanted speed, not truth. And in their race to close the deal, my job had shifted from necessary to inconvenient. Each memo I sent was treated like a smudge on their glass, something to wipe away before the buyers arrived for the tour. I could feel myself being pushed to the edges, the quiet woman with the rules who was now an obstacle instead of a safeguard. I began to notice subtle signs that unsettled me. A recurring meeting labeled Controls Deep Dive suddenly turned private, the attendee list hidden. A vendor exceptions directory that once had 87 files shrank overnight to 82. When I asked, I was told it was just housekeeping, but housekeeping does not erase compliance addendums tied to vendors moving customer data out of state. When I pressed further, I was told those policies were outdated. Outdated, I repeated to myself, staring at a stranger's name on an approval sheet I had never seen before. It felt like walking into my own house and finding the furniture rearranged by someone else. By then, my resentment had shifted into something colder, heavier, less patient. I could see the direction they were moving, the staged smiles, the buzzwords floating like balloons across every meeting. They wanted me silent, erased, folded into their illusion of a flawless transition. But I knew the truth. I carried the receipts in my files, in my notebooks, in my memory. And as I sat through those flashy presentations about synergy and clean growth, I smiled back at them the way you smile when a neighbor swears the storm will miss the town while black clouds gather overhead. Because I knew the storm was already here, and when it broke, no emoji in the world would be enough to save them. It started slowly, like a shadow stretching across my calendar. At first, I thought it was a scheduling error. A standing meeting called Risk Controls Review, which I had attended for years, disappeared from my screen. When I checked my paper calendar, the one I kept as a mirror to the digital version, I saw the rectangle penciled in clearly, but online it was gone. I sent a polite note to the organizer, asking if the invite had been updated. The reply came back almost instantly, cheerful but hollow. We are keeping the group small for this sprint. 2 exclamation marks, as if exclusion could be softened with enthusiasm. I wrote the sentence down word for word in my notebook, boxed it with my pen, and told myself to watch carefully. That was the first cut, but not the last. The following week, I noticed a different kind of disappearance. On Monday morning, the vendor exceptions directory I managed contained 87 files. By Wednesday, it had 82. When I asked about the missing documents, operations told me it was standard housekeeping before the big show. I thanked them, but later I pulled the audit trail myself. 5 files had been quietly deleted, including one tied to a vendor who shipped customer data out of state every single night after 10 o'clock. When I clicked into the approval history, I saw my notes stripped away and a new line marked outdated. Outdated. I repeated under my breath, staring at the entry. It was not outdated. It was accurate. And now it was gone. Someone had erased my fingerprints and scribbled a stranger's name over the truth. The legal department began behaving differently too. For years, the general counsel had been quick, sharp, replying to emails at 6 in the morning with punctuation that landed like elbows. Suddenly, she stopped putting anything in writing. Instead, she began calling me directly with the phrase, "Let us just talk this through." The first time it felt courteous. By the third, it felt like someone throwing a towel over a lamp. I started documenting those calls in plain text files, time-stamped the way I always did. April 10th, 9:02 a.m. Phone call with GC. Storage limit exception. Approval to formalize later. I did not delete those drafts. I saved every one. It was not paranoia. It was insurance. Meanwhile, the junior analyst assigned to shadow me began asking odd questions. He hovered behind my chair one afternoon and asked, "What is the shortest version of the risk register? Is there a 3-bullet version?" I inhaled slowly before answering. "There is a version that will not get us sued," I said. His smile faltered. For a moment, I felt almost guilty for shattering his casual tone, but then I remembered the shredded memo and the missing files. I pointed to a vendor name on the screen. If we pretend this did not happen, we own it. Owning it costs more than telling the truth now. He nodded politely, like a tourist listening to a guide he did not believe, then walked away. By then, I knew what was happening. This was not oversight. It was strategy. They were shrinking me out of the frame, reducing my role from a voice of caution to a footnote, then finally to silence. Invitations were rescinded. Files vanished. Notes were scrubbed. My name was being deleted from the system, piece by piece, like I had never existed. They thought erasure would be clean, painless, final. What they did not realize was that I had been documenting everything, quietly, steadily, without fail. And the more they tried to push me out of the picture, the sharper my outline became. Their erasure was my proof. And in the end, the very act of deleting me was the evidence that would undo them. It was a Monday morning in April when the betrayal finally stopped pretending. I logged into my computer at 6:40 a.m., the same time I always did, a steaming cup of coffee beside me, ready to run my weekly audit trail before the office filled with noise. When I opened the compliance dashboard, the screen blinked red. Unauthorized access. Contact administrator. I refreshed once, twice, then tried the shortcut on my desktop. Nothing. I sipped my coffee slowly, as if calm could fix it, then opened the IT ticket system and typed, "Access revoked from retention dashboard. Assume permissions error. Please advise." I hit send, even though deep down I already knew. This was no glitch. This was exile. By 9 o'clock, the calendar invite appeared. Quick touch base. Operations transition flow. No agenda. No notes. Just a location in one of those glass-walled conference rooms that made every conversation feel like a fishbowl interrogation. I arrived 2 minutes early, legal pad in hand, back straight, ready for whatever script they had rehearsed. At 9:12, Greg Talbot, Director of Operations, breezed in holding 2 coffees but offering me none. His smile was wide, his tone too bright. "Appreciate you making time," he said, like he was doing me a favor. He did not sit. He perched, as though his name sat higher than mine on the org chart and gravity itself could not pull him level. "We are in motion," he said, stretching the words like taffy. "Big changes ahead. Positive ones." I nodded politely, lips pressed in a neutral line. Then he dropped the hammer, casually, as if it meant nothing. We are streamlining, and sometimes that means we reassign. Nothing personal. I blinked once and asked evenly, "Who is taking over retention compliance?" His smile widened. "Thomas. New kid. Bright, efficient." Bright, efficient Thomas, who had asked me only last week whether data sovereignty was the name of a hosting platform. I did not raise my voice. I only replied, "That is not gatekeeping institutional knowledge. That is exposing the company to liability." He did not flinch. "We are building redundancy," he said, as though my entire career was a spare part in a machine. The word redundancy echoed in my head like a slow leak from a cracked pipe. I watched him stand fully upright, abandoning his perch now that his part was delivered. "No loose ends," he said, then winked, like we were co-conspirators in some poker game and I had just lost my hand. When he left, I stayed seated for 2 more minutes, staring at the glass walls reflecting my own stillness back at me. Then I picked up my pen and wrote one line on my legal pad. This is not transition. This is erasure. The words looked calm on paper, but inside me something darker stirred. Not grief, not even shock, but the cold weight of inevitability. When I walked back to my desk, my monitor was already black, logged out, my files inaccessible. A cardboard box sat neatly on the floor with my belongings packed, as if my presence had been scheduled for removal long before Greg's cheerful speech. Colleagues looked away, pretending to type, pretending not to notice. I felt my resentment harden into something sharper, almost metallic. They had not only stripped me of my work, they had tried to strip me of my memory, as though my years of vigilance had never existed. But what they did not know was that I had already begun preserving every trail they thought they could erase. Being locked out of their system only confirmed what I had suspected all along: that the real system, the one that mattered, was the one I carried with me. And they had just given me every reason to use it. That night, long after the office lights had dimmed and my badge no longer opened the turnstile, I sat alone at my kitchen table with my personal laptop. Not the company one. They had already shut that down mid-sentence. This was the old silver machine I had owned for years, slow but loyal, with a dent near the corner from the time I dropped it on the pavement. Beside it sat a battered external drive with a single word written in my handwriting: archive. I had not touched it in months. Tonight, it felt like a lifeline. I plugged it in, and the faint hum of its motor was almost like hearing an old friend answer the phone. I did not drag and drop in a panic. This was not theft. It was surgery. One file at a time, I began pulling what mattered. Final memos, compliance registers, meeting minutes, email headers. I did not keep drafts with commentary or frustration. I kept the official versions, the ones already sent, signed, acknowledged, and then conveniently forgotten. I labeled the folders with plain language: vendor violations, policy deviations, verbal approvals never codified. Each folder cross-referenced where it had lived in the company's server, each file double-checked for timestamps and metadata. By the time the clock struck 1 in the morning, I had finished only 2 of 5 major folders. My eyes burned, my neck ached, but inside me the nausea had cooled into something colder. Clarity. The truth was simple. They were not just moving me out. They were cleaning house, wiping logs, rearranging evidence as if the past itself could be rewritten. But my entire career had been built on refusing to let the past vanish. That was my job, to remember what others wanted to forget, to record what others wanted to bury. And now, stripped of my access and shoved into redundancy, I realized they had handed me the sharpest weapon of all. Every attempt they made to delete me became proof that they had something worth hiding. Their erasure was their confession. The next day, I walked into the office pretending nothing had changed. My badge still worked at the lobby, at least for now, though the delay in its beep told me it was living on borrowed time. I stopped by Thomas's desk, the bright, efficient replacement Greg had handed my role to, and asked casually, "Do you have access to the retention dashboard yet?" He smiled, eager, proud of his shiny new toy, and said yes. I leaned over, showing him how to match vendor logs to regional regulations, how to interpret legal's vague language, how to avoid the pitfalls no one had explained to him. He nodded quickly, scribbling notes, oblivious to the fact that each step I taught him was another nail in Greg's coffin. At night, I kept building my archive. I printed copies of high-risk vendor lists and slipped them into manila envelopes. I wrote indexes in spreadsheets, cross-referencing every document like a librarian of truths no one else wanted to catalog. My small apartment filled with quiet stacks of evidence, not chaotic, but organized with the same care I had always shown. And with each file I saved, I felt my resentment transform. It was no longer just anger at being erased. It was resolve, steady and unshakable. They thought locking me out would silence me. Instead, it had set me free. They could take away my desk, my access, my place in their meetings, but they could not take away the one thing that had always been mine. Proof. The official end came on a Thursday morning, the kind of gray morning where even the fluorescent light seemed tired. I arrived at the office to find a meeting invite waiting in my inbox. Subject line: Urgent Staffing Realignment Discussion. I did not need to open it to know what it meant. My badge had lagged at the turnstile, clicking like it was humoring me. That is how you know. When the system hesitates, so does your future. I carried my legal pad down the hall, back straight, steps measured, as though walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been written. The conference room was called Maple, one of those corporate tricks meant to make firing sound less brutal. Inside sat 3 people. HR manager Diane Porter, a woman with shoulders tight as wire. A representative from legal, one I had only seen at holiday parties, lips pressed into a line that pretended empathy. And a junior from operations, eyes darting like he wanted to disappear into his blazer. Diane gestured toward a chair across from them. "This will not take long," she said, sliding a slim folder across the table as if she were dealing cards in a rigged game. "As you know," Diane began, voice as flat as the scripted lines in front of her, "the organization is undergoing structural transformation in preparation for the merger. Several legacy functions have been evaluated for relevance, redundancy, and realignment. Among those roles, yours has been selected for dissolution as of 10 a.m. today." Dissolution. The word made me think of acid eating through metal, steady, unstoppable. I did not flinch. I simply folded my hands and replied, "Understood." My calm unsettled them more than any protest would have. Diane flipped to the next page, reading with the cadence of someone delivering lines at a community theater play. "Your severance package has been calculated in accordance with tenure. It includes 3 months base pay, continuation of benefits, and a 6-month non-disclosure agreement covering all material knowledge of pre-merger activities." I tilted my head slightly. 6 months, I repeated, tasting the number like it was foreign. Diane nodded. "It is standard," the legal rep added quickly. "It is strategic." I leaned back, eyes steady. 7 weeks until the merger closes. Interesting alignment. The junior from operations swallowed hard, looking down at his notes. Before Diane could continue, there was a polite knock at the door. Through the frosted glass stood a facilities worker, poor Randy, holding a cardboard box like it might explode. Diane cleared her throat. "We have arranged for your belongings to be shipped to your address." I raised a hand. "That will not be necessary. I will walk out on my own." The legal rep gave a shallow nod, relieved that I would not cause a scene. They reminded me not to access company devices, not to take files, not to create a trail. I smiled thinly. You already wiped my files. Did you not? I was typing an addendum to the Q2 compliance log when the invite came through. I hit save. It gave me an error. See, you pulled the plug before the body was even cold. The legal rep blinked, a flicker of surprise crossing her face too quickly for most to notice. I noticed. Diane shuffled her script and tried to regain her rhythm. We appreciate your professionalism. I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm, precise. Do not confuse silence for compliance. Then I rose, collected the folder without opening it, and straightened my blouse-like armor. I did not slam the door when I left. Slamming doors gives people something to feel good about. I gave them nothing but the sight of my back, straight as a ledger line. That evening, after the termination, I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not pour myself a drink or throw anything across the room. Instead, I set the cardboard box they had given me on the floor of my apartment and ignored it. My cat circled my ankles, unaware that my career had just been dissolved like sugar in hot water. I sat at the kitchen table, opened my personal laptop, and stared at the blinking cursor on a blank document. The silence in the room was heavy but not suffocating. It was clarity, sharper than any emotion I had felt all week. They thought they had erased me, but I knew something they did not. Erasure is impossible when the truth is already written down. I opened my email and searched for a message I had sent to myself months earlier. Subject line, Q2 Risk Register. Final copy. In case of creative memory loss. My own small insurance policy, tucked away long before I knew how badly I would need it. I clicked download, and the file opened to a gray spreadsheet with no flair and no drama, just row after row of evidence. Incident date, vendor, policy violated, financial exposure, mitigation attempted, resolution status. Most of the last column contained the same word, ignored. Some said deferred, a few said pending legal, but nearly all were blank. I scrolled slowly, line by line, my jaw tightening. Each entry was a scar I had tried to prevent, each one dismissed until it became part of a larger wound. Row 27. The time operations bypassed two-factor authentication for a favored vendor because it slowed them down. Row 46. The data sharing incident legal buried under temporary miscommunication. Row 63. The unauthorized expansion of an overseas contract outside our compliance zone, flagged by me in June, laughed off in August. I remembered Greg's voice, smooth and smug, saying, "No one will care when we are printing money post-merger." But I had the receipts. I had the email threads, the memos, the sign-offs, the metadata. And now, for the first time, I had freedom. They wanted me gone, and in pushing me out, they had cut away their leash. I opened a fresh document and typed a single line at the top. Q2 Risk Register. Formal submission. Prepared by Claire Dawson. Verified and time-stamped. Beneath it, I began structuring the report cleanly. No commentary, no anger, just facts matched to exhibits. Every memo linked to its policy. Every exception matched to its trail. I knew exactly who needed to see it. The board of directors, the very people being sold a story polished with half-truths and missing pieces. They thought they were buying a company with clean transitions and no legacy debt. What they were really buying was a time bomb. My job was to hand them the timer. When the draft was finished, I saved it not as a working file but as a final submission. I built a companion document labeled Supporting Exhibits, with every attachment organized and hashed for authenticity. No loopholes, no excuses. Then I opened my Gmail and drafted the message. Recipients, the board distribution list. Subject line, ignored warnings. Compliance exposure. The body was just one sentence. You have been misinformed. Attached was the PDF, lean and unflinching. I did not press send. Not yet. Instead, I scheduled it. Delivery, Thursday, 5:05 p.m. 1 minute after my 6-month NDA expired. Timing mattered more than rage. Timing was everything. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat in the corner of the screen. They thought they had silenced me. They thought shredding my memos, deleting my files, and boxing up my desk would be the end. But they had mistaken silence for surrender. What they did not understand was that silence has teeth, and when it bites, it leaves marks that never fade. The day my scheduled email was set to go out felt eerily ordinary. I made coffee, watered the plant on my windowsill, and answered a text from my sister asking if I was still coming to the lake that weekend. But underneath the quiet routine, a clock was ticking. At precisely 5:05 p.m., my file, the one they had tried so hard to bury, would land in the inboxes of every member of the board. I spent the day checking and rechecking my work, opening the PDF, clicking each link to ensure the exhibits loaded, verifying that every timestamp was intact. By 4 o'clock, there was nothing left to adjust. All I could do was wait. Waiting, it turns out, is its own kind of storm. At 5:05 on the dot, the email left my outbox with no fanfare, no sound effect, no visible fireworks. Just a quiet whoosh into the ether. Somewhere across town, in a boardroom high above the city, someone opened it. The subject line was sharp. Ignored warnings. Compliance exposure. The body was blunt. You have been misinformed. The attachment carried 67 pages of risk logs, policy violations, vendor failures, and legal acknowledgments. The first few rows alone were enough to make a person sweat. By the 5th page, there would be no doubt. By the 10th, panic would set in. My phone started buzzing at 5:12. Unknown number. Straight to voicemail. Then another, and another, stacked on top of each other until the notifications looked like a tower of falling bricks. Legal. HR. Even Greg. I let them all ring. I was not interested in their explanations or their sudden need for my cooperation. For years, they had treated my work as noise. Now the noise was all theirs. The irony was not lost on me. I sat back, folded my arms, and let silence answer for me. By 6, the messages had changed in tone. A voicemail from a board member's assistant, voice shaking, asking me to return the call immediately. Another from someone at the acquiring firm, words clipped and furious, saying due diligence had been paused. Then one from Diane in HR, dripping with forced cheer, suggesting we revisit options and perhaps consult discreetly if I was open to it. I deleted them one by one, each erasure a quiet echo of the shredder that had once eaten my memo. This time, however, the power was mine. They could not shred the truth. Not anymore. News travels fast inside corporations, faster than truth, but truth has a way of catching up. By the next morning, my contacts inside the company began sending me messages. The merger is on hold. Compliance team is in chaos. Greg has been placed on leave. Each ping lit up my phone like small firecrackers, evidence that the storm had broken wide open. They had spent months polishing numbers, scrubbing files, and staging the house for a sale. One email had blown the windows out, and I had not raised my voice once. I did not celebrate. Not yet. Revenge, when it is real, is not champagne and shouting. It is the slow satisfaction of watching people realize the walls they built were made of paper. I poured myself tea, sat on my balcony, and watched the city lights flicker on. They thought they had silenced me. They thought they had erased me. But all it took was one file, one moment, one click, and suddenly I was louder than all of them combined. By the end of the week, the ripples of my email had turned into waves that battered the company from every direction. My former colleagues messaged me in whispers, each note carrying a mix of fear and awe. The board is furious. Regulators are circling. The acquirer has suspended the deal. I sat at my kitchen table, phone buzzing every hour, and felt no rush of triumph, only the cool steadiness of inevitability. I had not raised my voice. I had not broken a single rule. I had simply kept the receipts, and in the end, the receipts spoke louder than I ever could. Greg was the first to fall. By Friday morning, word reached me that he had been placed on administrative leave, a sanitized phrase that meant his arrogance had finally caught up with him. The same man who winked at me in a glass-walled room and called my erasure streamlining was now facing his own. I did not smile, but I did allow myself one long breath, the kind that feels like air after being held underwater. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it exhales. On Sunday afternoon, my phone rang again, this time with a number I recognized. It was the chairman of the board. I let it buzz twice before answering, not out of spite, but because I wanted to hear the tremor in his voice when he finally spoke. "Your file saved us," he admitted, low and strained. He confessed that without it, the deal would have gone forward, built on lies that would have crumbled into lawsuits and investigations. He thanked me, though the words sounded more like penance than gratitude. Then he made an offer. An advisory role, direct to the board, high compensation, no interference. They wanted the woman they had erased to come back and fix the mess they had made. I listened quietly, the sound of his breathing filling the pause. For a moment I thought of all the mornings I had arrived before sunrise, the memos I had written, the warnings I had given, and the way each one had been dismissed with an emoji or a smirk. Now, suddenly, I was the only voice they wanted to hear. It was tempting, yes, but temptation is not the same as vindication. I told him calmly, "If you want me, there are conditions. Full back pay, legal indemnity, and credit for the work that was mine." He did not argue. He simply said, "Done." In that moment, I realized I had moved from disposable to indispensable without lifting anything more than a finger. That night, I walked to the balcony with a glass of wine and watched the city lights glitter like tiny fires. I thought of the shredder, the moment my signature was sliced into gray ribbons, and the quiet vow I had made to myself that day. They had tried to erase me. They had boxed up my desk, locked my files, and shoved me into redundancy. But erasure only works when the truth is fragile. And my truth was not fragile. It was stronger than every lie they had built their merger upon. Sometimes revenge does not come with noise or spectacle. Sometimes it comes with patience, with silence, and with one well-timed move. I had been underestimated for years, treated like background noise in a room full of applause. But silence, when used correctly, can be the loudest sound of all. And as I stood there watching the city breathe, I knew one thing with perfect clarity. I had not just survived. I had won. Times silence is mistaken for weakness, but silence, when used with patience and timing, can be the most powerful weapon of all. I learned that erasure is never final when you carry the truth, and that revenge does not always roar. It can whisper, and still shake the walls of those who doubted you. Have you ever been underestimated, erased, or silenced at work? Did you stay quiet, or did you find a way to make your voice heard in the end? Share your experience in the comments. I would love to hear your story.